Welcome everyone to our fourth, whatever that is, fourth um, episode of this season, where we are going to be looking at Genesis 12. And I don't know that I've actually stated it, but I try and put titles for every session that we have. Part of that is because it helps me articulate what I'm trying to share. And I kind of liked the name I put for Genesis 12, which I simply titled for myself, Enter the Hero, which is like we've had all these chapters up to this point, and it's been like a long shot if you're talking about like narratively or from like a film perspective. The whole first 11 chapters have in many ways been this long shot of humanity, and rarely is God intimately involved, except, the very first part, he's intimately involved, but everything else is kind of, you feel like it's at a distance. And here we go from here on out through the rest of Genesis. We have close-ups of individual characters the rest of the way. So we're going to change the scope. Now, with that changing scope, I think it's really important for us to stop and think about what we've experienced and explored in Genesis 1 through 11. And that's primarily because we're about to shift, as I've mentioned, in Genesis 12 to 50 into something that is a different genre of literature, has a very different feel, and it seems to be trying to accomplish different aims. So previously, I have said Genesis 1 to 11 is generally in the genre, the literary genre of mythology, using the technological, the technical meaning of the term. But I want to stop and take a half step back and invite you for a moment to reflect on that with a couple of questions that I have. How, not worrying about the words that I've used, but use your own words for a moment. How would you describe what we have seen in chapters 1 through 11? And I invite you to take yourself off mute and share that with everyone if you feel comfortable, and we'll try and explore that for a moment.
So I have a question for you, Corey, but
Yes.
I'll answer your question first. For me, it's dealing with the children of Israel trying to explain the world and its creation and starting how things happen. And it seemed that they used the cultural references and the stories from their time, which for me is not an issue. But for me, when you look at it like, hey, this is supposed to be truth, it's hard to process that. It's like, man, the story of creation is supposed to be truth. What do you mean you got it from somebody else, or it's a similar story to somebody else's culture? So that's a little bit challenging in that aspect. But it's kind of cool to see almost, I feel like for me, it removes God out of the box, and to see how the intricacies and the creativity of the Bible that is displayed that many times can be overlooked because we're trying to look at this like, hey, this is truth and this is how things actually happen, instead of looking at, hey, this is a story that was shared. And with that context, I feel like it's very freeing for me to look at it in that context, like, wow, God, you're bigger than just what my mind has put you in, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think that's a very important perspectival change, right? The idea of recognizing that most of us come to the Bible with whatever it is that we've constructed in our mind, what's been handed to us, and we've reconstructed within ourselves. And when we challenge some of those thoughts, we realize we haven't changed God, we've changed ourselves. And that's an important way of understanding this new way of engaging the biblical text. Yeah. So you had a question as well, did you say?
Yeah, so just recently thinking, especially with Pride Month being last month, and this idea that the rainbow isn't used for distortion, but a promise. So was that promise ever made? Like, is that a promise? I mean, unfortunately, we can't say like, hey, this is truth, but in this story, when this promise was made, can we say that, hey, God said this? Or is it, how do we take that? How do we take that promise that was made in a story that may not be completely true, if that's a misunderstanding?
Yeah, I see the question you're asking, which I think is this. Okay, so understanding that there are layers of complexity and truth is different than reported historical fact. Now we want to ask that question. God, according to the story, promised never to destroy the earth again with flood. Is that a promise we can rely upon? Does that sound like part of what you're getting at?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's a couple of things going on for me. One is the way I try to look at it is I think of this as the Israelites who are telling the story did believe it to be true. So what I have to do is say, I know it kind of kicks the can down the road a little bit, but what I'm saying is I believe that they believed it was true. And that we are in this lineage of faith of those people. So, like, on one level, I have nothing but a choice to make regarding, am I going to believe what they thought was true, or am I not going to believe it? And that's part A. Part two is the idea that the character of God as expressed throughout the entirety of the Hebrew Bible is consistent with the promise that could be made in that kind of space. Mm-hmm. And so for me, I look at that and I think the promise is true in that God is choosing not to destroy humanity in that sort of way again, because that seems to be what the Israelites believed God promised them. And because we have evidence, one, that it hasn't happened throughout this whole period of time, but also like that God has revealed God's self to us in ways that are consistent with the promise like that.
Okay.
So I know that's like, it's not just, yes, he did, and therefore we can. I that would be great, but I can't say that and not get myself into hot water in other places, is the way I would like to put that. Because the reason I articulated that so carefully, or tried to do so carefully, was because I think there are other places where I say, yeah, the ancient Israelites believed that, but it then seems inconsistent with other things we see in scripture. And that's one of the places where I'll go, yes, the Israelites believed it, but I don't think it's so. So that's why I think it takes two parts, or at least two parts, to determine whether I want to weigh in on the side of the story or against it.
All right, thank you.
You bet. Other thoughts about Genesis 1 through 11 and your description of what we have seen in those chapters?
So at least this time around, kind of going through it, I'm thinking just about similar to what Maurice was saying, it being more about the way things, like how things came to be. And so it's more of like from a distant past, trying to make an explanation, but it's still speaking or written from a particular time and a place and a culture and a people, and so like, I don't know, I feel like I've in previous readings of these stories kind of separated, who's doing the speaking and where they're at, like losing a lot of that and just saying, all right, what's being said. And it's almost like, because we don't think about it as mythology or anything like that, we're not thinking of like, hey, there's a people and they have a particular reason for writing this material. I feel like we ascribe Genesis 1 through 11 like from the mouth of God. Like I don't know that I've heard anyone like teach that or say that, but I feel like that's kind of how we read it, as who else could be there in Genesis 1:1 but God. He wrote this and told us like what happened. Like that's kind of what we take away, if you will. And so to like take a step back and go with someone not only wrote this but had a reason for writing and what they're writing about in a particular time and all that. So I think that's what I've seemed to focus more on in all of this more recently. But yeah.
And then the only other thing that I'll say is I went back and listened to what I missed while I was at dance last week. And so the only thing I had written down when you proposed your initial question was exactly what you said, that what we've read in chapters 1-11 may very well be true and not necessarily historical fact. And so it really helped the 2 points that you gave, A and 2. This idea of this is probably what they believed, and I have to answer the question of whether or not I believe that as well. And then also, is it consistent with the character of God that I know? Because not only am I reading about people who seem to know him, I also know him and his son. And so I think that that perspective really helps me when it comes time to possibly disagree with what somebody else might propose. This idea of we need to look at the Bible as either an instruction manual or absolutely throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I can kind of live in this in between a little more comfortably through relationship and then also study and knowledge, which I think is always my goal, but articulating it in this way sits really well with me, my reasoning for being able to do that and being comfortable with not always having a good answer, but having a response.
Yeah, that's good. And maybe not having an answer, but also not throwing our hands up that we'll never get to an answer, or that we can't come to a place that is comfortable for us, that at least answers the question for the time being. Yeah. I find a whole range of responses when I'm asked questions. Like sometimes it's like, I don't know, I don't think we'll ever know because I don't think it's answerable, to, yeah, I've studied that, I've figured it out. And another one is like, I'm working on something and it's kind of sitting with me for a day, a week, 10 years, whatever. Yeah.
But I think that is like the brilliant spot, is when we get to a place where we can say like, hey, I'm still moldable because I'm still in progress and I'm still learning new things. And I don't, like, personally, I don't ever want to get to the point where I think I understand everything, right? Because then like the beauty of the mystery is gone and I'm no longer teachable. And so like, I think that going to that posture of like, I'm in an active learning is a really smart place to approach scripture for life. Like, hopefully that's a lifelong posture.
Yeah, I like the way you put that. That's good. Amy has said something to the idea of, I don't want to worship a God that I fully understand, because that kind of puts me on the same level of God. And then that's not worthy of worship. Like, I'm certainly not worthy of worship. So like, God needs to be a little bit better than me. So, let me ask another way of approaching Genesis 1-11 is, how well does what we see in Genesis 1-11 match the description of mythology? Does it, like how do we live with that descriptor? And as long as we're there, what problems are there in utilizing that description? Maybe not for people sitting in this room, but as we encounter others.
For me, I think it goes to that word like myth in mythology, right? Because all of a sudden there's an assumption that this is just a false story that, and then I think it's easy to dismiss, as opposed to, it doesn't necessarily mean that did it happen as described or not? Like, that doesn't really matter. There's a message being conveyed that can still transcend the reality of it happening. But to me, I think myth is easy to bring in misconceptions. And so it requires that next step of explanation of defining mythology. I think it's a really appropriate word to use for this section of scripture. It just, because mythology is weighted with certain an understanding what the expectations of that's going to be. Bringing myth into a religious holy book like requires some description.
Yeah, I agree. I think that generally, at least prior to doing Genesis studies, in the past couple of years, I think that has been not a word that, myth or mythology is, part of my normal vocabulary, except to contrast what is true, like my biblical beliefs, and everything else. Like, oh, okay, what makes your God different? Well, my God is real and all the others are myths. As you can see, when you talk about Roman gods or whatever, you have to jump into mythology. When you talk about, Greek gods or whatever, we're talking about Greek mythology, Roman mythology. Like so mythologies are usually attached, like it's a adjective that's attached to, some other, or it's the noun that usually it's modified by some other belief system that's not mine. And so like I like to keep like, okay, so me real, everybody else mythology. So then when you say, so what about your mythology? It's like, hold time out. I don't have one of those because all of my stuff is real. And so, yeah, then it immediately has to make you challenge, but there's a lot of things that we don't take literally in scriptures because we understand, the symbolic nature of it and stuff like that. It's internal, but we never have to put it in a category because we're not talking scientifically or academically about it. So as long as we're never talking academically about it, we never have to use the word mythology. But anytime we're talking about these other belief systems, we're usually doing it in a classroom setting where we're calling it what it's actually called in everything else. So yeah, so I think they're not on the same playing field because we never put them in the same classroom.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the challenges there. And then the other, like I'm thinking like my Bible now, because we've got, the Bible app, which has it in 100 different languages, or not just the different languages, but different translations or versions of it, that I can get the most modern day reading like me and you are talking, and that's how it speaks to me. And even when we get like an English translation of the like New My Leash or something, it's like it still sounds very different because Eugene Peterson hasn't made a message version of it. Like there isn't like the modern day chit chat version of this that almost makes it sound like it was written today. And so like how do we almost compare these kind of things on a regular level? And like I think of like Tall Tales or something like that. Again, we can still talk about them and explain the point of why we have these things and these stories without I think it would be better if we were able to introduce this language in our settings and not be afraid of it, because it would remove some of that stigma so that we wouldn't be sitting here splitting hairs about historicity. We can kind of get past that conversation and really talk about what's the point of these things. Like if we just, got that off the table and we weren't so like problematized by the word mythology, I think we could, have a deeper conversation about what is Genesis saying versus what's on.
But I think that I like what you're saying, and I think that speaks to even a larger issue of like, this whole concept of like fake news, right? Like we're having a hard time like teaching like the idea of like logical thought and sources and like looking at like even with like news. And so and not just so like the expectation of people to come to scripture with like that's like doing the work of stepping deeper, like that's hard. And I feel like really lazy because we even like if people aren't going to do that to the news, how are we going to expect them to do that with an ancient book? Like that's hard.
Those are all good points. I love your comment, Chris, about mythology. I don't have one of those. That's fantastic. And yeah, the idea that people struggle with that notion. I'm going to put one of several things I ran into. I threw that in the chat. It's a link to just some guy who wanted to articulate something about Genesis 1 to 11. And it was, I think, well stated, very reasonable. There's nothing weird in there. The comments get interesting. And one of the people who pushes back in the comments is like, no, I'm sorry, you just don't get to call the Bible mythology, right? There should be some clues, and if it were mythology, there'd be clues in the text that it is. And I just wanted to say, oh, sweet person, there are a lot of clues that this is. Your lack of understanding the clues does not mean they're not there. So, yeah, I think this is healthy discussion. One of the things I found, I'm always asking the question, how do you explain some phenomenon or this story or this dynamic that's going on to the intelligent non-specialist, right? The person who hasn't taken the time to dive into it to the level that you have. How do you do that? And so, for instance, in general, I may not use the term mythology, even if I describe every point of it, right? So I say, oh, like this text cares a lot about first things. Oh, this text doesn't describe characters in kind of like a psychologically deep way. They're kind of flat characters, right? And another important thing, especially about Genesis 1 through 11, is you can kind of suggest that, it's not recording everything. And, like you can do that by saying like, okay, so who did Cain marry? Like, right. So some other people existed somewhere somehow, but the biblical text isn't explaining that. And it just kind of lets you figure out, oh, okay, logically, there are just other people. And so it's the reminder that the lens, in this case, what is written becomes like a lens through which we are looking, can only capture some part of it. And ultimately, to suggest that what is in the biblical text is everything we need to know is reductive of God, right? God is bigger than the lens through which we are looking, even when that lens is the biblical text. So it's a subtle way of introducing the idea of perspective about what is and what is not there, and how that is an important element to talk about when we're dealing with the biblical text. I don't know if somebody was speaking when I started, but I kept going. So did I step over somebody?
Yeah, I was going to ask you, can you repeat your question again? So
Yeah.
I can make sure I can answer it.
Sure. The question was kind of, how would you explain these chapters to intelligent non-specialists? That's a term I like to use, especially in the classroom when I'm teaching, because it kind of carries some presuppositions to it, right? Somebody who is smart enough to understand what we're talking about, they just haven't slowed down to do it. And that they're also coming without an agenda of deconstruction, but rather honest inquiry. So that opens the door for robust conversation, but you may not want to lead with the haymaker of, haha, this is mythology, boom, right? So yeah,
I think Chris and Megan did a good job explaining what I thought, but I think the thing is also understanding is as you said, Corey, is a perspective and context, is that just because this part is mythology doesn't mean the rest of the Bible is mythology. And I think it's important to kind of say, where does the buck stop? Because again, thank goodness for the Bible app and these things is I appreciate poetry, but man, do I hate Isaiah. I'm like, oh my God, like what is real? What is not real? Like, is this a fictional world? God, where are we in time and space now? And that was frustrating for me. But now understanding the context and how things are laid out, my perspective changes. And as my perspective changes, how I read it changes. And that's important as processing this whole entire Bible that has different sections and perspectives and contexts that need to be taken into consideration.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Too many of us read the Bible through one lens. You know, this is true. This is everything I need to know, period. And yet they'll make subtle adjustments in their own mind when they read a parable from Jesus and realize, oh, like this isn't literal. This is a story to explain something else. But like, you see, they've made the switch in their own mind about a different literary genre, but they won't acknowledge it kind of outwardly. So, yeah.
So something that I've been able to do is utilize the resources that I have. I'm not a Bible scholar, so that's not in my back pocket. But what is a couple of different platforms and social skills. So us doing Bible study every morning with a group, we talk about the things that we have discussed here, and it allows other people to hear it and also think on those things too, because they have a relationship with us. Not only that, I lead a very small Bible study. It's just 3 of us. And in this go round, I had a requirement. And it was, we're all going to read different versions. And I think just in looking at different versions of the Bible, you get an opportunity to talk about what it's saying. And so that's been really cool. But I said, and we're each going to pick a resource, a different resource. So in one person's using David Guzik as their Bible commentator, somebody wanted to intentionally try to find a female commentator. And last time we got together, she actually broke up with her because she didn't like what she was saying.
You need to give some suggestions if you've got some.
But I did. But yeah.
No, not you.
Oh, Corey. Yeah. I didn't have any female. Yeah, I didn't. Yeah. So it was just a whole thing. But like, and it was cool because instead of me trying to convince them of something, like there's poetry and maybe even mythology, it was cool to come from somebody else, whether it was somebody I agreed with or not. Yeah. And just getting my friends to even realize, hey, who are you citing? What scripture are you even talking about? What verse? And it's just really opened them up to deeper thought without me having to implant my thoughts and new knowledge.
It's really good.
Often, I mean, it's so good. I think many times you can just kind of go, hey, look at all this stuff. Help me understand that. Like, you help me, as I'm bringing it to you, understand this. And that unpacks it. And yeah, it does all the work for you, right? Well, are there any final wrap-up questions any of you have about Genesis 1 through 11? Any questions, comments, or snide remarks? And then we can jump into Genesis 12.
Let's go 12.
Let's go to 12. Well, I will just say that Genesis 1 through 11 is great. It's interesting. There's so much there. And it does, one of the reasons we went slow and one of the reasons I probably did more talking in general is because of the way in which it's so out of most of our wheelhouse to talk about those kinds of chapters in the ways that I do. But I think we're going to experience a little bit shift of tone that allows us all to be a little more participatory and less just me talking at you as we explore what's going on. I will not leave you hanging, of course. I've got lots to say. I'm never short for things to say, but we'll engage slightly differently moving on. So Genesis 12, the big switch, enter the hero. Let me just read the first 3 verses for us. And the way I've broken up Genesis 12 is basically into 3 units. This is more or less, the way you might conceptualize it. Genesis 12, 1 through 3. It's the initial encounter, the first scene with Abram, and then 4 through 9, where Abram moves to Canaan and kind of throughout the land, and then 10 through 20, where Abram and Sarai goes to Egypt and has a really fascinating story there. So let's see how far we can get. And with 1 through 3, I'll go ahead and read these first verses. Now, the Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great. And so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the ones who curse you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. So that's that first unit. Like, God shows up and gives the instructions to Abram. So Nahum Sarna has this really great introduction to this chapter, and I'm going to read it in full as well, because this is really interesting. Sarna says, the story of Abraham opens without an identifying formula or a preliminary observation of the type that introduces the Noah narrative. So I didn't talk a lot about this, but it has happened several times throughout Genesis 1 through 11, for instance. It starts with, now these are the records of the generations of, right? That's a very standard formula that they utilized in Genesis 11. I believe it's perhaps Genesis 10 as well, and Genesis 5, those kinds of introductory phrases that kind of say, hi, new story unit. And this doesn't, it just launches in. It's like a TV show. It's a cold open, right? We haven't flashed the screen up on the thing on the screen that tells you even what show you're watching. It's just, here we go. So it says, Sarna continues, the patriarch bursts upon the scene of history with outstanding suddenness. The first 75 years of his life are passed over in total silence. God's call comes in an instant without forewarning or preparation. It is brief and compelling in its demands, and Abram's immediate response marks the true beginning of his life. The momentous events unfold with startling rapidity, and any introductory embellishment could have only had a diminishing effect. So he kind of says the cold open is the greatest way to have introduced our hero. So, right, it just starts with, boom, God says to Abram. So do we know where Abram is in this moment, right? He's in a place called Haran. So if you look back a few verses, back to 11:31, it says Terah took Abram, his son, and Lot, and the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, his son's wife, and they went out together from Ur of the Chaldeans in order to enter the land of Canaan, and they went as far as Haran and settled there. Okay, so where is Haran? Let me show you a picture. All right. If I move my mouse on the screen, can you see the mouse? Cool. Okay, so here's Haran, right? Now, there's this river here that is going up from the bottom right to the top left and then kind of curves up over. That's the Euphrates River. You've heard of the Tigris and the Euphrates before, I am sure. The Tigris starts at the Persian Gulf and more or less runs directly north. The Euphrates moves kind of northwest, so they do that. And the land in between is known as Mesopotamia, between the rivers. And the Euphrates goes quite far west into what is now modern-day Syria. And there is this big bend where it kind of, for a portion of the river, it's going almost directly west, and then it curves directly north. And on this map, that sees, you can see that at Mari in the lower right-hand corner. It goes directly north for a little bit, and then it pretty much goes back to northwest. Then there's the Habor River, and then it's not labeled, but I believe it's the Bialik River that Haran is on. And that goes straight north out of the Euphrates, or, obviously it's running south into the Euphrates. But I'm describing this in terms of, well, simply backwards, I guess. Okay. So Haran is just directly north of where the Euphrates River is. And some of the question is, like, why did they go to Haran? And I did not chase this detail down, but The patron god of Haran, I believe, is known as the god Sin, which is the moon god. So Sin, not as in sin doing wrong, but Sin as the name of the moon god. And that was potentially the same patron god of the city of Ur, or at least at that time period. I should have chased that one down, but that's just kind of in the back of my mind that that's the reason to pick that city. Oh, here's a city with the same patron god. Clearly, we will do well here. Okay, so they get to Haran. Terah decides to stay, but God calls Abram further on. So let me actually also share one more picture of that map, but from a slightly larger perspective. Let me see if I can bring that up. Here is another map that's, the lens is zoomed out a little bit further. So you see the Persian Gulf, right? And here is Ur. And you go up the Euphrates eventually to get to Haran. Now this whole area is modern Syria. And then if you kind of go further west, you get to the Mediterranean Sea, and then you would go south. And that's what will be described in these next several verses. But when chapter 12 begins, Abram is in Haran, which is some fair distance away from where Israel is and where he's going to. Is that helpful to see a map like that? It's the reminder, too, that Terah could not have gone straight west from Ur to go to Canaan. That's like impassable, especially in the ancient world, right? You can't just strike out across the desert for 2 months without like water supplies. So you have to stay by the rivers. So that means you can't go west. You have to go north, northwest. Then you can go west. Then you can come back down south. So that's the geography that kind of matters to what to the story. Somebody, I believe it was Wenham, noted that God's voice has not been noted or recorded for 10 generations, according to this story, right? And so this is like a new thing again. Like God has sent the flood, and now he has basically not talked to humanity, or it's not been recorded that God has talked to humanity for 10 generations. So this seems, that reinforces the notion of the suddenness of the story and the compulsion to do something. Hi, here I am 10 generations later, go do this thing. And then we get this fascinating poem of promise. We can unpack all these things, but basically it's like everything an ancient person would have wanted, right? Well, it's calling him out of all the things that are comfort, away from your relatives, away from your father's house, which is protection and social protection, and go to a land that I will show you. And it seems to suggest that Abraham's not going to know till he gets there, right? And then it says, here are all the promises that an ancient person would want. A great nation, I will bless you, which in the ancient world typically means material wealth. Your name will be great. And that's about the best thing you can promise an ancient person, right? Your name will be great. And then it kind of suggests the standard thing, like if you do this and you follow me, then everybody who will use you as a yardstick, you will be the yardstick of blessing. You shall be a blessing. And those who bless you, I will also bless. And those who curse you, I will curse.
It's interesting, sorry, because we were talking about the story right before this, right, was the Tower of Babel, and it said that they were trying to basically storm heavens in order for their name to be great. So it's interesting how right next to each other we have a story of a group of people trying to make their own name great. Right after that comes Abram, where God is saying, I'm going to be the one to make your name great.
Yes. In fact, that seems to be, according to many commentators, one of the reasons why that story is right in front of Genesis 12. It's like there's nothing in this that suggests Abraham was striving for it or hoping for it or asking for it. in direct contrast to those who were. We're going to make ourselves great. And God's like, you don't get to decide that. I do. And so God shows up in the next chapter and says, look, I've decided it's going to be you, not them. So that's a good observation. Yeah. Any other questions or thoughts about Genesis 12, 1-3? It's pretty easy to see what's going on in the on the surface, isn't it? Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if this would be the time, maybe later, but is Abraham my father? And am I part of the covenant? Oh my goodness.
We're one of them.
Right. Am I one of them? And now I don't feel like I'm one of them after reading 1-11. But I guess it'd be a separate conversation of how the covenants now come into play when now we may not be a part of Abraham. I could be a Canaanite and not know it. I'm not sure.
Well, okay. So from a Israelite, Judahite, Hebrew Bible perspective, you may or may not be, right? But from a perspective of Jesus, Jesus allows everyone into the kingdom by saying participation in the kingdom of God is no longer just genetic. It's now relational and by volitional choice. And so are you? Yes, absolutely. You are a member of the covenant of Abraham by virtue of the fact that Jesus kind of comes and turns things on their head. But one of my rabbi friends would say some interesting things here, which I do not want to speak for him, but he takes very seriously this notion that the world is going to be blessed through the Israelites so far as they are faithful to God and are good to other people, right? They're not special because they get to they get special perks, get to cut in line and things like this. Their chosenness is about a responsibility to all humanity, and humanity gets blessed through their obedience to that, to what God is calling them to, which means we get to receive those blessings because of the faithfulness of the Jewish people.
Okay.
Yeah. But okay, so you're also asking another question that I think is really, really fascinating and important. And in a sort of vague way, I think I can address some of this. The question is, when do we start thinking historically about some of the details that we're engaging? Now, in Bible studies, up until it was even into the 80s, I think, most histories of Israel would begin with Abraham. And it wasn't until, I want to say it was 1980 or 84, I think it was John Bright who wrote a history of Israel in 1984, at least that might have been one of the first editions, that really said, you know what, we can't start with Abraham, we have to start with David, because just everything before David is too nebulous historically to write a history book about it. That kind of opened the floodgates. Then there came a whole bunch of other people who through the late 80s and early 90s who kind of said, we really can't write a history of Israel until Nehemiah, right? And some are like, no, we really can't write one until the Maccabees, right? So Nehemiah's 440, the Maccabees are 160, 1,000 years difference. And they were known as the ones who want to push it all the way back are known as nihilists, in that we can say nothing about the early years historically. Okay. I would say that when we think about these things, we may not have enough to write a history book, but these things don't stem from nowhere. They don't, you don't have a story about David unless there's some sort of person who is that cultural touchstone for your people. Now, is he as wonderful as everybody says he is? Maybe, maybe not. But like, there's somebody who did the thing that we're remembering, right? So for me, I'm like, David is easy. I think David existed. And I don't know that he looks like he did in the biblical text at every point, but like, they're remembering something. Okay, but how much further back can we go? And one of the things we're going to see in Genesis 12 through 50 is a lot of these ideas that this is where Sarah is buried. This is where Isaac is buried. This is where that thing happened. This is where this thing happened. Well, that is suggestive. Like, those become like holy sites for people. This can cut both ways, but I think what I'm getting at is the notion that these sites pop up because there is something that the culture decides to remember about this spot that pertains to something in their ancient past. Now, again, I don't think these things are made up whole cloth. There might be tenuous threads between those links, but things that are made up whole cloth don't seem to have the tenacity of stories that hold the people together for years and years. So for me, does Abraham exist? I'm inclined to believe that there is somebody who was perhaps named Abraham, who was a distant ancestor. And do all these stories work? Do they represent real elements in his life? Potentially, with some modifications. I feel much more comfortable about talking about Abraham as a historical figure than I do about Noah or, Adam and Eve. But I'll still kind of read it with a grain of salt. So that's my perspective. And I can recognize that a lot of people are not going to land in the same place that I land. So is that helpful?
Yeah, because this is where I would lay my hat at as far as historicity.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think it's, again, what you have learned and going through, and like that children's song. It's just like, now it makes me question, like, this is like a Maury show. Like, who is my father? Like, I know this is bad, but okay, good stuff.
Excellent. Well, let's move on to verses 4 through 9. And can somebody read those for me, just from whichever translation you have, so I can take another drink of water here?
I have the holiest version, the New King James.
Oh, wonderful. We'll listen to this.
Okay. So Abraham departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And Abraham was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Then Abraham took Sarai, okay, his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions, and they had gathered, and the people whom they had acquired in Haran, and they departed to go to the land of Canaan. So they came to the land of Canaan. Abraham passed through the land to the place of Shechem, as far as the terebinth tree of Moreh, and the Canaanites were then in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abraham and said, to your descendants I will give this land. And there he built an altar to the Lord, who had appeared to him. And he moved from there to the mountain east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent with Bethel on the west of Ai, on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. So Abraham journeyed, going on, still set toward the south. Ugh.
Can I ask a question, Corey?
Yes, please do.
Maybe I'm not fully understanding, but if I'm remembering correctly, Lot was traveling with them because Abraham's brother died, right? Like, he didn't have any parents.
That seems to be the case, yes.
So if this is any kind of historical situation, why in that culture did Lot not become his son for all intents and purposes?
Well,
Is that not the way it works? I'm just asking.
Yeah, so Lot becomes part of Abram's household, so to speak, because it was just the cultural expectation that the oldest brother would take care of his brother's children. And so his brother dies. He's like, I'm taking care of the child. He's probably not a child if Abram is 75. Lot must be, I don't know, middle-aged, maybe even 50, whatever, somewhere in there, 60, whatever. I don't know, right? And so it's just this notion that a very young 75, yes. I think it's the notion that the family unit is highly structured in this notion of something called the house of the father, the Beit Av, which really starts with a patriarch of a family whose children and potentially their children, and then other people for whom they would be responsible for, like a brother's son after they've passed. You don't branch off until it's kind of time. And I don't know if that's always clearly articulated, but so Lot has to fold into Abram's family in this case.
So because he and Sarah, were wanting a child, I guess I'm just wondering if, after all, hope seemed lost, why that didn't become, or maybe, I don't know.
Sure.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to figure out.
Why they didn't just say, all right, Lot's our kid now. Yeah. Because they wouldn't want to stop the lineage of Lot and Lot's father, because that would, in a sense, be taken away from that lineage, and you don't want to do that.
Okay, that's the piece I think I was missing and trying to figure out.
Yeah, there are laws that talk about how to maintain a person's lineage after they die without children, that kind of thing, trying to ensure that every lineage continues, so to speak. It's important for in that culture. So a couple of things. We note that he's 75. We note that in verse 5, it talks about all the possessions and, unfortunately, all the people that they had acquired. Yes. There's not a lot to say, but I think one of the major reasons this particular verse is here is to underscore the idea that Abram was well off before the end of this chapter, which we will see momentarily, right? He gets some gifts from Pharaoh, but they want you to know, no, he was already good. He already had a lot of stuff. So I don't have a lot of explanation about the acquiring people. I don't know what that looks like. It's not entirely clear. Interesting, though, the first site in Canaan that they note is Shechem, right? And the oak or terebinth of Moreh, perhaps the tree of teaching, something like this. These are not what end up being the northernmost parts of Israel. They're a little bit further south than that. So that's kind of just an interesting detail. But I love what comes next in verse 6, which is, now the Canaanite was then in the land. So let me just ask you, how do you hear that particular sentence?
Are you saying that it is singular in the Hebrew? Because mine, it's plural.
Let me read it. It's technically singular, but it's trying to represent a people. This is not a singular versus plural thing.
Okay, then I'm not catching what you're wanting us to answer. Sorry.
Okay. Let me overemphasize the words that I'm trying to go for. Now, the Canaanite was then in the land.
Yeah. I was getting the picture that either we are like, for one, the fact that they need to be mentioned at all is that they are significant and probably not welcomed like, oh, okay, cool. Yeah, that may have been their land then, but it's our land now, kind of a thing. And also, they existed there in the land that was their like prominence. And yeah, times have changed.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it
I
just
think
seems like
good. Yeah, that's one very good insight, right? Like they're identifying people with whom they have problems with down the road, right? He doesn't walk in and immediately have problems with the Canaanites, but they reference it because down the road they will. But what does that then tell us?
That it was written after, right?
There we go. Right? It's that simple little notion that this is highly suggestive of the distance between the events and the person writing it down. And it's those little moments that remind us that this is not like an eyewitness account. And perhaps, I didn't dig deep into the redactional layers of this particular text, but it could be that this is even composed from the perspective of not until later, where Canaanites are already an issue, right? So there is a distance that we always need to be mindful of, and this is that little reminder that's in the text itself. Even the medieval rabbinic commentators talk about this. So they landed hard on the then in the land, right? Yeah. Yeah, there it is. All right. What else in these few verses?
I think it also, though, like theologically speaks to the difficulty. Like they've set Abram up to meet, like God's promise isn't just going to be easy to obtain, right? To have descendants while he's old. God is showing him this is the land, like you're going to get some land, but there's people in it. So I think that it's setting up this, like there are hurdles in place for the promise to be fulfilled.
That's a good point. I like that it's not just the age that's a hurdle to overcome. Yeah, right. It's the people that exist in the place that is being promised to him. Yeah. Notably in verse 7, for instance, Abram builds an altar. And this is a little reflective of the early Israelite practices of worship, which we note that the patriarchs don't seem to worship at established places, but rather build these places. And they either build them for the purpose in a place, or they return to a place where they have built something previously. And that's a manner of the worship that they do. Now, altars are intended for sacrifice. They are not just lecterns to give a sermon from, right? You're going to kill something on it, and that's what they're designed for. So if he builds an altar, he is killing something on this altar, likely some sort of fatted calf or whatever, in order to worship God. It talks then about how he moves north from Shechem, which is pretty close to the Sea of Galilee, down to Bethel, which in Hebrew is Beit El, which is the house of God. That's a fairly well-known one now in English. A lot of people know that particular one. But that's more or less in the center of the country, which on one sense would be like near the south of where Israel is. As I think I've mentioned before, right? Israel is kind of the northern half of what we think of as modern Israel, and Judah is the southern half of what we think of as modern Israel. So it's kind of saying started near the Sea of Galilee, down to about the midway point, which is where Israel and Judah kind of have their border, and camped in between Bethel and Ai. Ai means ruin. So this is thought to have been a place that had been ruined a long time ago. And then he proceeds south towards the Negev, which is if we were to look, for instance, at the Dead Sea, let me see if I can share this one more time, because I think this might be helpful. Okay, I'm going to actually make this bigger. Okay, so as I mentioned, comes from Haran down to Shechem. Bethel and Ai are, more or less in the middle. And the Negev is down here. But the Negev really starts way up here in between this 4 and this 6. Right? That's how far north the Negev reaches. And so that's kind of representing the southernmost place of reasonably arable land for Judah. Like if you get into the Negev, you are in desert. You are in a pretty inhospitable environment. So part of what is being articulated here is that basically Abram went from north to south and stopped at a couple places in between. And they're really trying to emphasize he walked through that whole land. And we should remember these places from his very first responding to the promise, he hit the key places. But also notice though that the places that are noted are more or less in the highlands. He did not go into the coastal regions where probably the stronghold of Canaanites would have been. Does that make sense? He's walking through the more sparsely populated areas. Okay. So that's interesting because that ends up being where the Israelites really make their first homeland, is in those highlands. Very much like, the Scottish people in the Highlands. It's easier to defend those kinds of regions. So that's verses 6, 7, 8, and 9. Yeah, so he travels towards the Negev. And I don't know that we've got time to really unpack the next passage. Maybe we do. I don't know. Let's just try. Okay. So, Megan, can I have you read 10 to 20 real quick?
Yes. Now there was a famine in the land. So Abram went down to Egypt to reside there as an alien, for the famine was severe in the land. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, I know well that you are a woman beautiful in appearance. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife? Then they're going to kill me, and then we'll let you live. Say you are my sister, so that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life might be spared on your account. When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. When the officials of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh. And the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And for her sake, he dealt well with Abram. And he had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female slaves, female donkeys, and camels. But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh called Abram and said, what is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and be gone. And Pharaoh gave his men orders concerning him, and they set him on the way with his wife and all that he had.
So as I mentioned, in an earlier verse, they want to say, look, Abram already had some money. He gets more from Pharaoh, but he already had it. In this little episode, just 10 verses, he ends up with kind of more money. And he gets to go back to Canaan momentarily. But this is kind of what sets him up as a person who is able to subsist in a land that is not easy to live in without resources. It's somewhat inhospitable, and he needs all those resources in order to live there. But what is this story? What's going on here? Go ahead, Megan. You were
I had a question. It was interesting. So normally, like in a lot of these stories, they refer like it's Abram this, Abram that. But here, like they take moments to just say the woman. Like, is there something significant in that at all, or is it just because she's a woman that she loses her name?
I see what you're saying, like in verse 14, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
15. And the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. Well, we already know who it is. Why not just use her name? Is that just the patriarchy? That's what this is. Stupid patriarchy.
Maybe. I haven't thought of that before in particular, but Isha can also mean wife, and it might be emphasizing the fact that like she is indeed his wife, and that so like that reinforces this is a tenuous situation for them, right? So while she is unnamed, it also reinforces that she is in a partnership with Abram. And this is, I don't know. I don't know. It could just be patriarchy, but there.
So maybe it's a patriarchy in the translation, but like the story itself is emphasizing just like relationally, she's the wife. Like that could be.
Yeah, I'm curious about that because I would not. It wouldn't surprise me at all to think that the use of the word ha'isha is not patriarchy or dismissive or whatever, but rather is trying to emphasize a particular point. And I just haven't like determined what that point is yet. But thank you for highlighting that. That's interesting. Okay, so this is one of 3 episodes where one of the patriarchs says, she's my wife. No, she's my sister. Okay. Really awkward. But they utilize this in order to kind of get out of a tricky situation, because in this case, Sarai is apparently she was renowned for her beauty. And this is something that some early Jewish commentators latched onto and became a very big deal for some of them. All we really have is this text that kind of says she's really pretty, and Abraham's like worried. Now, girlfriend must be really pretty if at 65 she's still turning heads, right? So like most of us stop turning heads like I'm done, like so no. Anyway, it's interesting that he both seems to have this fear but has called it. Like he knows what the potential danger is, because what he says could come true does in fact come true. So it's not like he's being alarmist, but it is pretty clear that, as I've mentioned before, a lot of the Jewish commentators kind of recognize this as a sin on Abram's part, or certainly a frailty or a fault. This is not something they believe he should have done. I pause at that point because it's hard to say. Like, I'm not saying he did the right thing. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is a lot of the ancient texts value this kind of cleverness more than some sort of articulation of behaviors that you would, say, oh, that's a sin or that's not a sin, right? Lying to people is not always considered sinful. Even in the 10 Commandments, it's not lying that's so bad. It's bearing false witness, which has a connotation of like a courtroom type scene, right? Where it matters that you tell the truth of historical fact or factual detail regarding a detail, right? So I don't know exactly what's going on here. I don't know if they're trying to highlight his cleverness of getting through this situation, or if they're like, no, he made a mistake and he got lucky by getting paid through this mistake. Because he gets paid, I'm inclined to think that this is a little bit of his cleverness that is being highlighted. Okay, so he utilizes this notion that she is his sister and not his wife. And as we see in Genesis 20, verse 12, where this same thing happens, at some point he responds in 20:12, well, let me back up a verse to 11. Abraham said, I did it because I thought there is no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, though not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. So it's one of those things where it's like he's telling a partial truth, not a full truth and not a full lie, right? So they're playing up the part that's going to get them saved, not and it's interesting to think, right, that they're not worried about this particular detail of what we would now call incest, right? So
I read that one thought is that maybe the event, like this event, didn't happen twice, that it may have been like a cultural memory of a story that happened once, but then it's maybe this is two different stories of that event that were put together in the Abraham story. Where do you land in that?
Well, I wasn't prepared to talk about that tonight.
I'm so sorry. You don't have to.
But I'll highlight the issues that are at stake, right? Okay, so the idea is this is not the only story in the biblical text that is known as where a story is repeated almost so thoroughly that you're like, is this one story told twice, or is this some event that just happened very similarly multiple times? So those are often called doublets. In this case, it's a triplet because it happens 3 times. I will actually hold my final answer here, but I will note this. Ancient texts have a way of telling stories that are really, really resonant or really, really repetitive in order to ensure that the story, the overarching points they're trying to make within the story get through. So I think, well, no, I guess I will say, like, in general, I think doublets and triplets tend to be one story told multiple times from different perspectives. But you have to engage each doublet on its own merits. Because I think it is possible. Now, the other side that we have to balance that against is the idea that stories then can be framed through what are called tropes. The idea that this is how you tell a story. So there are lots of stories about meeting women at wells. Okay. And some of those stories look alike, but because they look alike doesn't mean that it was the same event told multiple times, so much as if you're going to tell that story, here's how you frame it. Right? Similar to the idea of if you're going to talk about a contest between good and evil in the Old West, you're probably going to talk about the shootout at high noon. Right? If that happened more than once, it's not that, I mean, it's like it could have happened multiple times, but it might look really similar so that we're tempted to say, no, it only happened once, it's just told lots of times. Rather, it could have happened lots of times, but the framing of the story follows certain patterns that make it look like it's only once, right? Am I saying that clearly? Yeah.
So is it important then to pay attention to like the differences in the stories to look for like maybe why, like what the significance of that story is?
Yes, absolutely. And that's the kind of thing you would do as you look at a doublet or a triplet, is try and figure, I mean, if it is a concern to figure out, is this one story told twice or is it 2 individual stories? You have to see if there are textual clues. I'm not quite fresh on Genesis 20 to be able to make those comparisons right this moment. So, but like in general, on some of these patriarchal stories, I'm probably inclined to think that it's, and for reasons that we haven't explored yet, that a lot of these patriarchal stories are what I would suggest are very much local traditions that get woven together. And sometimes that means 2 different people had a story about Abraham doing this and they just remembered it differently. Like, I don't know, as if like we got 2 stories about how Abraham behaved in a particular, Abraham Lincoln behaved at a certain period of time in his youth, right? And so it ends up getting told twice, but it was more like this community remembered it this way and this community remembered it that way. And then they get reintegrated together, you know? So that's the way I generally lean, but for a lot of reasons that we haven't explored yet. I'm trying to think if there's anything important else. One important thing I think about this story is even if the story is designed to call attention to Abram's cleverness of getting out of this situation, I don't think he still comes off looking good, right? He's not looking good in this situation. And that's an important thing because the patriarchs throughout Genesis are not depicted as like demigods or perfect humans. They are depicted as mortals with frailties and shortcomings. And that's an important detail that is quite different than a lot of other ancient literature. There is a reality to their heroes and their ancestors that many of the other ancient texts don't have. So that's neat.
Yeah. I was going to ask if that was what they're driving at, or is that just is that a feature versus a bug? As I'm, we were reading this, it did draw me to Genesis 3 and this idea of like the serpent being, crafty or wily or what, cunning or whatever you want to call it. And knowing that may culturally be a neutral term that's not specifically, speaking to a morality issue and like this is a problem, but it does like kind of have you second guessing, making you go, wait, okay, hold on, is this good? Like it makes you ask the question, but it doesn't necessarily tell you the answer. Yeah. And so, but I am then still left asking the question. So that is where, like, as I'm trying to say, hey, this isn't really speaking to morality, or maybe this is actually a value that they say is probably a good thing that he was so, clever. Is it doing more than that in the sense of possibly making it complicated, and even you possibly could look bad, but I just want you to think negatively about him. I don't know. Yeah. So that's where I was like, is this the intention or?
Well, I don't know about intention per se, but I do think that you hit upon something about, is this a feature or a bug? I think this is a feature of Israelite narrative, that they are willing to put their heroes through the ringer from a morality perspective. They're willing to show their frailties and faults. And I think this is part of what differentiates Genesis 1 to 11 and 20 through 50 is the narrative in many ways, because it's not mythology, becomes more sophisticated. You can simultaneously like suggest cleverness is something we value, but like this was a really kind of cruddy thing to do. Like, come on, like you put your wife's life in danger to save your own. Like, that's not okay, even if it turns out okay. I think that's the kind of complexity that is now available to us now that we've moved into Genesis 12 and on. And I think we're going to start to see that level of complexity more often in the text, where it's not just straightforward, hey, good guys wear the white hats, bad guys wear the black hats, and that's the way it goes. It's just not like that anymore.
So in terms of, what about like sweeping big representation of ancient Near Eastern like text in their culture? So like in the sense of like, they not only is the individual both like having good traits and bad traits, but also like the nation of Israel as a whole, or when they split or whatnot, like is like there's very much a like we are not perfect, right? Like we're in exile because of our sin, sort of like refrain. Like they paint their large scale group of themselves as not perfect. And so it mirrors that individual. Is that also seen then in other texts, or do other texts only speak to how great and mighty they are as a group?
I wouldn't go so far as to say that it doesn't occur in other texts. I will say it's not it does not feature as regularly as it does in the Hebrew Bible.
So they're okay. That's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, as I think about this, like that, it's just not a general feature of other, like of Egyptian texts, of Babylonian or Assyrian texts that I've read, of Ugaritic texts. I'm not suggesting it never happens, but it is not something, it's not like a recurring thing. So, I mean, in some ways, the longer I've been doing this, I've been gravitating towards this idea that Israel's self-critique is perhaps one of the most unique things of their contribution to the world, right? Their ability to say, whoa, that was on us. Like, that's kind of fascinating, because most people are just like, no, we're good. We're always good. Like, if something went wrong, it's somebody else's fault. So let me just share two final things, and then we'll wrap up the formal portion of this. Couple of things regarding historicity. Like, we cannot identify which pharaoh this would be. There's just no way of knowing. The text doesn't say anything, and it's not entirely clear when Abram would have gone down into Egypt. But note that Abram goes down into Egypt. And so this is part of establishing this idea that as pastoralists who practice something called transhumance, like the idea of long-range pastoralization of their flocks, it was not unheard of for the people who lived in Israel to go down into Egypt, because it's kind of the breadbasket of that region, right? And to kind of come back. So at the first sign of famine, although it was a pretty bad one, as the text says, a heavy famine, where do they go? They go to Egypt because they can. That's what's there. So it's not unsurprising. But which pharaoh? We can't say. And the second thing is, there's this really interesting little thing. Where is it? In verse 16, it talks about what they gave to him, and it includes the term camels. Aha. Camels were not used in Egypt until the Persian period, more than 1,000 years later. And they were not widely used in the ancient Near East really until about 1200 BCE. So that's just some interesting detail. I don't think it's super important. It's all right. But it is that reminder of the distance between the story and the being written down, like not knowing exactly what happened in the past. So let's wrap up there for at least the recording here. For next week, we're going to continue with this notion of the setting the stage of Abraham as the hero and what he accomplishes. So we're going to be reading through Genesis 13 through 15. So I encourage you to read that on your own before next week. And I will see you next week.